Gunboat Diplomacy of Compellence as distinguished from Deterrence. Introduction. Gunboat diplomacy is the conspicuous use or threat of limited naval force to influence the behavior of another state without resorting to full-scale warfare. The term evokes 19th-century imperial powers dispatching warships to coerce weaker nations into granting trade concessions, repaying debts, or settling grievances. Yet beneath this broad definition lie two distinct coercive strategies, deterrence and compellence. Political scientist Alexander L. George, one of the most noted scholars on coercive diplomacy, distinguished between a threat intended to keep an adversary from starting something and a strategy intended to make an adversary do something. The two are not interchangeable, and their distinction is particularly consequential in the maritime realm. The naval blockade provides the starkest illustration of this difference. The same instrument, a line of warships sealing off access to a port, can be deployed either to deter an adversary from attacking a neighbor or to compel an adversary to cease a weapons program. The strategic logic, operational demands, and political risks diverge sharply depending on which objective is pursued. This essay traces the conceptual origins of compellence, distinguishes it systematically from deterrence, and examines how each functions within gunboat diplomacy, drawing on historical and contemporary examples. Theoretical foundations, George's coercive diplomacy and the compellence-deterrence distinction. George's central contribution was to develop the framework of coercive diplomacy, which he defined as the threat of force, as a means of restoring peace. He characterized coercive diplomacy as the use of intimidation in order to get others to comply with one's wishes. Coercive diplomacy is similar to what Thomas Schelling earlier characterized as compellence, but George emphasized that it is a defensive strategy undertaken in response to an opponent's encroachment or aggressive action and seeks to persuade an opponent to cease his aggression rather than bludgeon him into stopping. This distinction is crucial for understanding gunboat diplomacy. The goal is not to destroy an adversary's military capability but to influence its will and perception. According to George, there are three possible goals for coercive diplomacy: to get an adversary to stop an action already underway short of its goal, to persuade the adversary to reverse an action already carried out, and to attain cessation of the opponent's hostile behavior through a change in the composition of the adversary's government or in the nature of the regime. George's framework explicitly distinguishes coercive diplomacy from deterrence. Deterrence uses the threat of force only to dissuade an opponent from doing something that has not yet begun, while coercive diplomacy compellence aims to induce an opponent to stop or reverse an action already taken. As George explained, the general idea of coercive diplomacy is to back one's demand to an adversary with a threat of punishment for non-compliance that he will consider credible and potent enough to persuade him to comply with the demand. Coercive diplomacy involves four basic variables: the demand, the means used for creating a sense of urgency, the threatened punishment for non-compliance, and the possible use of incentives. Barry Bleckman and Stephen Kaplan further refined the understanding of coercive diplomacy in the naval context, arguing that with coercive diplomacy, military units themselves do not attain the objective, goals are achieved through the effect of the force on the perceptions of the targeted actor. This insight is particularly relevant to gunboat diplomacy, where the mere display of naval power can alter perceptions and achieve political objectives without firing a shot. George identified five basic types of coercive diplomacy: the ultimatum, the tacit ultimatum, the try-and-see approach, the gradual turning of the screw, and the carrot-and-stick approach. The ultimatum employs demands and threats, and imposes a time limit for compliance in order to enhance the adversary's sense of urgency. The try-and-see approach makes a demand and then opens by employing relatively mild coercive force. If the adversary does not comply, coercive force is increased. When gradually turning the screw, the coercing power makes explicit at the outset its intention to apply increasing degrees of pressure until the adversary complies. When the coercing power supplements its threats with incentives, it employs the carrot and stick approach. These strategic variations have profound implications for naval coercion. Deterrence at sea often requires little more than the routine presence of naval forces, a carrier battle group patrolling international waters, or a standing naval task force. Coercive diplomacy at sea, however, demands an affirmative intervention, a blockade that physically interdicts maritime traffic, the seizure of vessels, or the bombardment of coastal targets. Gunboat diplomacy, definition and scope. Gunboat diplomacy is the use or threat of limited naval force, otherwise than as an act of war, to influence foreign policy outcomes. The term originated in the 19th century, when Western powers, particularly the United Kingdom, France, Germany, and the United States, leveraged their naval superiority to intimidate less powerful nations into granting concessions. The mere presence of warships off a country's coast was often sufficient. Actual use of force was rarely necessary, though blockades, bombardments, and landings were employed when intimidation failed. Historically, gunboat diplomacy has been predominantly compellent in character. Commodore Perry's 1853-54 expedition to Japan is the classic example. Perry sailed a squadron of heavily armed black ships into Japanese waters, presented a letter from the U.S. President, and made clear that refusal to open trade relations would be met with force. The demand was not to maintain the status quo but to change it, to compel Japan to end its 200-year policy of seclusion. Similarly, Britain's First Opium War 1839-42 against China involved a compel-lent strategy. British warships overwhelmed Chinese naval defenses, bombarded coastal forts, and compelled the Qing Empire to accept the Treaty of Nanjing, which ceded Hong Kong and opened 5 treaty ports to British trade. Not all gunboat diplomacy has been compel-lent. The Cold War saw extensive use of naval forces for deterrent purposes. The United States and the Soviet Union deployed naval task forces to signal resolve, protect allies, and deter aggression without firing a shot. The Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, while involving an air and naval quarantine, not a formal blockade, is a paradigmatic case of coercive diplomacy that blended deterrent and compel-lent elements. The U.S. demanded the removal of Soviet missiles compel-lents while threatening retaliation if Cuba were attacked. Deterrence. Systematic distinctions, compel-lents versus deterrence in the naval context. The differences between compel-lents and deterrence, when refracted through the lens of gunboat diplomacy, can be organized along 4 dimensions: strategic objective, initiative, operational demands, and target incentives. Strategic objective. Deterrence aims to preserve the status quo, compel-lents aims to alter it. A naval force deployed to prevent an adversary from seizing a disputed island is engaged in deterrence. A naval force deployed to compel an adversary to withdraw from a previously seized island is engaged in compel-lents. This difference is not merely semantic, it determines the entire logic of the coercive campaign, from the selection of targets to the design of escalation ladders. Initiative. Deterrence is reactive, the coercer waits for the adversary to act and then responds. Compel-lents is proactive, the coercer takes the first affirmative step, often by initiating a limited use of force, and then demands that the adversary respond with compliance. A naval blockade, for example, is not a deterrent measure, it is an act of compel-lents, because it actively interdicts maritime commerce and will continue to do so only until the target complies. Operational demands. Deterrence places fewer operational demands on naval forces. A carrier battle group can deter simply by being present and visible. Compel-lents, however, requires more intrusive and sustained naval operations, blockades must be enforced continuously, vessels must be stopped, boarded, and potentially seized, coastal targets may require bombardment or missile strikes. These operations carry greater risk of escalation, collateral damage, and diplomatic backlash. Target incentives. The target of a deterrent threat has a strong incentive to comply by not acting because compliance costs nothing in terms of reputation or domestic politics. The target of a compellent threat, however, must take an affirmative action that is publicly visible and potentially humiliating. This face-saving problem is a major reason why compellence is harder to achieve. Leaders may resist compliance even when the military balance favors compliance, because yielding to an explicit ultimatum undermines their authority at home and their credibility abroad. Case studies: compellent gunboat diplomacy in practice. Commodore Perry and the opening of Japan 1853-54. This is the archetype of compellent gunboat diplomacy. Perry's fleet of steam-powered warships, the Black Ships, was technologically superior to anything Japan possessed. Perry delivered an ultimatum: open diplomatic and commercial relations, or face the consequences. The demand was for Japan to do something to abandon its seclusion policy and sign a treaty. Perry employed the try-and-see approach. He conducted naval exercises, fired blank rounds, and made clear that force would be used if necessary. When Perry returned in 1854, Japan signed the Treaty of Kanagawa, opening 2 ports to American vessels. This case illustrates the logic of compellence. The coercer takes the initiative, demands a change in behavior, and backs the demand with a credible threat of escalating force. The Venezuela blockade 1902-03. When Venezuelan dictator Cipriano Castro defaulted on debts owed to British and German creditors, Britain and Germany dispatched warships to the Venezuelan coast, delivered an ultimatum to pay, and when Castro refused, blockaded Venezuelan ports, seized vessels, and shelled harbors. This was compellence. The demand was for Venezuela to do something, repay its debts, not merely to refrain from an action. The blockade was a compellent measure. It imposed ongoing costs that would cease only when Venezuela complied. The United States eventually brokered a settlement, the Washington Protocol of 1903, but not before the blockade had demonstrated the coercive power of naval force. The Cuban Missile Crisis 1962, a hybrid case. The U.S. naval quarantine of Cuba, a blockade in all but name, is often cited as a successful case of coercive diplomacy, but it blended compellent and deterrent elements. The primary demand was compellent: the Soviet Union must remove its ballistic missiles from Cuba. However, the U.S. also signaled that an attack on Cuba would be met with overwhelming force, a deterrent threat. The quarantine itself was a compellent measure. It imposed a cost interdiction of maritime traffic that would continue until the Soviet Union complied. The crisis ended when the Soviet Union agreed to withdraw the missiles, demonstrating that coercive diplomacy can succeed when the coercer's threat is credible, the demand is clear, and the target is given a face-saving exit. Why compellence is harder: practical and psychological obstacles. The theoretical distinction between compellence and deterrence is not merely academic, it has practical consequences that shape the likelihood of success. First, compellence requires costly action. The coercer cannot simply set the stage and wait. It must commit resources, incur political risk, and potentially use force before the target has decided whether to comply. This upfront cost, both material and reputational, means that leaders will resort to compellence only when the stakes are high and alternatives have been exhausted. Second, compellence faces a credibility problem. A deterrent threat is reinforced every day that the target refrains from acting. A compellent threat, by contrast, must be made credible through demonstration, limited strikes, escalatory pauses, and the visible deployment of forces. As George noted, the success of any coercive diplomacy strategy will depend, in part, upon effective communication between the parties, and there is no simple guide to such effective coordination. Third, Compellence confronts the asymmetry of resolve. The target of Compellence has more at stake because compliance is public and irreversible. A leader who yields to an ultimatum may face domestic political consequences, coup, unrest, or electoral defeat that a leader who simply refrains from acting does not. This asymmetry means that the coercer may need to exert far greater pressure to achieve compliance than would be required for deterrence. Finally, Compellence risks escalation. Because Compellence involves proactive intervention, a blockade, a missile strike, a seizure, it carries a greater risk of sparking an unintended war than does deterrence, which by definition involves only the threat of force, not its actual use. The coercer must therefore design compellent operations with extreme care, building in pauses and off-ramps that allow the adversary to comply without catastrophic loss of face. Conclusion. Gunboat diplomacy is often described as a single phenomenon, the use of naval force to influence foreign policy. But this description conceals a critical distinction. When a warship appears off a foreign coast, it may be there to deter the adversary from doing something, or it may be there to compel the adversary to do something. The difference is not merely academic, it shapes the strategic logic, operational demands, political risks, and likelihood of success. Deterrence is passive, reactive, and status quo preserving. It requires little more than visible presence and credible signaling. Compellence is active, proactive, and status quo altering. It demands affirmative intervention, clear demands, escalatory pressure, and careful management of the target's reputational concerns. Historically, gunboat diplomacy has been predominantly compellent in character, from Perry's opening of Japan to the Venezuela blockade to the Cuban Missile Crisis, but the record also shows that compellence is harder to achieve than deterrence, for reasons rooted in the psychology of decision-making, the dynamics of domestic politics, and the inherent risks of military escalation. As naval powers continue to deploy their fleets in pursuit of foreign policy objectives in the South China Sea, the Persian Gulf, and the Black Sea, the distinction between compellence and deterrence remains as relevant as ever. Understanding that distinction is the first step toward designing coercive strategies that are not only effective but also proportionate, credible, and resilient in the face of an adversary's inevitable resistance. The gunboat may have changed from 19th-century sailing vessels to 21st-century guided missile destroyers, but the strategic logic of compellence and deterrence endures. Appendix: Analytical benchmarks for evaluating compellent gunboat diplomacy. The essay above focused on historical case studies and the theoretical distinction between compellence and deterrence, primarily drawing on Alexander L. George's framework of coercive diplomacy. However, it did not systematically apply a structured set of benchmarks, i.e. measurable or observable criteria, to assess the effectiveness of compellent naval operations. This appendix introduces 5 such benchmarks, derived from more recent scholarship, that can be used to evaluate past or future instances of gunboat diplomacy. These benchmarks are not employed in the main body of the essay, but they offer a rigorous analytical toolkit for researchers. Benchmark 1, the Crisis Stability Index. Source: adapted from Peter Viggo Jacobson, Western Use of Coercive Diplomacy After the Cold War, 1998. This benchmark measures the degree to which a compellent naval action avoids accidental escalation. It comprises 3 sub-indicators: communication channels, were real-time, secure military-to-military or diplomatic hotlines active during the operation, pre-designated escalation pauses, Did the coercer build in automatic pauses, e.g. for 8-hour ceasefires after each limited use of force to allow the adversary to comply? Geographic containment. Was the naval operation confined to a clearly defined maritime zone, e.g. a blockade perimeter with explicit warnings against straying outside a high crisis stability score suggests that the compel-lent threat is less likely to spiral into unintended war. Benchmark 2, the Face-Saving Adequacy Scale. Source, derived from Matthew Waxman, The Dynamics of Coercion 2002, with Daniel Beeman. Because compel-lents demands a visible affirmative act from the target, the provision of face-saving mechanisms is critical. This benchmark evaluates whether the coercer offered the adversary a plausible way to comply without humiliation. Indicators include private compliance channels. Were compliance negotiations allowed to proceed quietly, without public ultimatums? Third-party mediation. Did a neutral actor, e.g., the UN Secretary-General, propose a formula that allowed the adversary to claim it was responding to international pressure, not directly to the coercer's threat? Symmetrical withdrawal or concurrent concessions. Did the coercer also agree to a reciprocal action, e.g. lifting the blockade incrementally as the adversary withdrew forces? Low face-saving adequacy correlates strongly with compel-lents failure, as leaders prefer costly stalemate to humiliating surrender. Benchmark 3, the Naval Proportionality Metric. Source, inspired by James Cable's Gunboat Diplomacy 3rd ed. 1994 and Modern Law of the Sea Principles. This benchmark assesses whether the level of naval force used was proportionate to the compel-lent demand. Excessive force can trigger domestic backlash and international condemnation. Too little force fails to convey credibility. The metric includes force-to-demand ratio. Was the number type of warships, e.g. destroyers versus patrol boats, commensurate with the political objective, e.g. demanding a treaty revision versus demanding cessation of illegal fishing? Collateral damage potential. Did the coercer avoid targeting civilian maritime infrastructure, ports, undersea cables, desalination plants unless the demand was existential? De-escalatory transparency. Did the coercer publicly announce rules of engagement that minimized harm to neutral shipping and non-combatants? Operations that score high on proportionality are more likely to sustain domestic and international legitimacy, reducing the adversary's incentive to resist. Benchmark 4, the Compel-Lent Clarity Index (CCI). Source, developed from George's demand specification variable but refined by Bleckman and Kaplan 1978 and later by Todd Sixer 2017, Gunboat Diplomacy in the 21st Century. Many compel-lents failures arise from ambiguous demands. The CCI measures, explicit action required. Did the coercer specify exactly what the target must do, e.g. withdraw all naval vessels 50 nautical miles from Island X by 12 o'clock GMT on May 10? Verifiable compliance mechanism. Was there a clear, objective method, e.g. satellite imagery, on-site inspection, third-party monitoring to confirm that the target had complied? Deadline visibility. Was the deadline communicated directly to the target's leadership through multiple channels, and was it publicly stated to create international pressure? A CCI score of 3, all criteria met, strongly predicts successful compel-lents. A score of 0 to 1 predicts failure or protracted crisis. Benchmark 5, the Post-Compliance Stability Forecast. Source, drawn from empirical work on coercive diplomacy outcomes by Danielle L. Lupton 2020, Reputation for Resolve. This forward-looking benchmark assesses whether a successful compel-lent operation will produce lasting stability or merely postpone conflict. It includes resentment vs. acceptance. Did the target's leadership frame compliance as a strategic necessity, acceptance or as a temporary humiliation to be revenged? Resentment regime survival. Did the complying leader survive in power for at least 12 months after the crisis? If not, compel-lents may have triggered a coup or revolution, leading to a more hostile successor. Recurrence rate, was the same coercer forced to repeat a similar naval demonstration against the same target within 5 years. A positive post-compliance stability forecast requires acceptance, regime survival, and non-recurrence. Applying the benchmarks illustrative. Had these benchmarks been applied to the Venezuela blockade 1902-03 discussed in the main essay, the results would be: crisis stability, low, no direct hotline, no pre-designated pauses, but geographic containment was clear. Face-saving adequacy, very low public ultimatum, no third-party mediation, no reciprocal concession. Naval proportionality, moderate blockade and shelling were arguably excessive for debt collection. Compel-lent clarity, moderate demand was clear, pay debts, but compliance verification was vague. Post-compliance stability, low, Venezuela resented the intervention, but the regime did not immediately fall. However, the U.S. intervened again in 1908. These benchmarks would explain why the blockade succeeded in the short-term debt was repaid but produced long-term instability and set a precedent for coercive gunboat diplomacy that the United States later sought to curtail via the Drago Doctrine. Conclusion of Appendix. These 5 benchmarks: Crisis Stability Index, Face-Saving Adequacy Scale, Naval Proportionality Metric, Compel-Lent Clarity Index, and Post-Compliance Stability Forecast, offer a more granular, operationalizable toolkit than the theoretical distinctions used in the main essay. Future research on gunboat diplomacy should apply them to contemporary cases, e.g. China's island building in the South China Sea, Iran's tanker seizures in the Strait of Hormuz, to determine whether compel-lent naval coercion has become more or less effective in the 21st century. The main essay provided the conceptual foundation. This appendix supplies the analytical instruments that remain to be fully utilized.